So one of the interesting things about doing Psytrance production for 6 years now is that I get more and more appreciation for the more psychedelic types of Psytrance. And that is all culminating in a recent project where I'm making some nighttime Psytrance. This is the first solo project where I'm doing that. I've done a collaboration with Mind B, which hasn't been released yet, which is also a nighttime track. But this is my first solo project, which gives me ample opportunity to actually show it to you in content. So that is what we're going to do today, starting with the kick and bass. And what I want to talk about is how extremely simple the kick and bass is going to be for something like this. There are a few things that I'm doing that are interesting, but mainly it's just very, very simple stuff. So let's start off with the kick patch here. What we can see is that this is a Audiojack kick drum patch, as many of my kick drums recently are. Well, essentially all of them, because I really like making my own kicks now. And one of the things that I've learned from Mind B, what he is doing a lot, is accentuating extra punch over what I used to do. And just having your kick a little bit higher is also what happens in a lot of nighttime, I believe. So personally, for full-on Psytrance, I'm a fan of more sub-heavy and like darker kick drums, which have less punch over here and have the sub-bass more towards the end here. So that would look something like this, maybe even like that. These kind of shapes. But for nighttime, a more punchy-oriented kick drum works better. So that is why we have stuff like this. Not really sub-heavy in the sense that it doesn't really have a lot of that like 40, 30 hertz kind of area. It doesn't even go that low. It goes to 49 hertz in G here. But the energy is also much more focused to, as you can see over here, roughly 110 hertz is where the maximum is. And of course, you're also going to need a pitch envelope. One of the interesting things that I'm doing is that I'm tuning it here, as you can see. But I'm not actually tuning it to the key of the bass line, because the bass line is actually in G sharp. So you can see here we have the bass line playing in G sharp and the kick is just kind of coming below that. That does mean that it's not entirely like in phase all the time, but I've noticed that I like the sound more generally with all my kick drums where there's a little bit of bounce to it, in the sense that the sub bass of the kick kind of scoops slightly under where the sub bass of the bass is. And that means that you kind of get like a little step up in the lowest of frequencies in that low end when the kick stops playing and the bass line starts to play. In terms of other processing, there's very little stuff going on. We have a little bit of transition stuff happening over here. Then we have an EQ and then we have a final clipper that just clips off the transient. You can see there's nothing set up other than the oversampling, which I haven't even turned on. But you would set that to maybe 2 here because we're not doing a lot of clipping. And all this final clipper is doing is actually just catching the transient. You'll see that it's not actually catching any of these peaks over here. So as you can see, very, very simple kick, and the same is going to be true for the bass patch. We just have a serum patch over here, which is just a custom wave shape. You can see that we have set up the basics that you need for a bass line. So we have our phase set here, phase randomization to 0, and then we have a filter where it's going through a filter shape like this. This is just set to envelope mode so that it's nice and neat within the 16 note. And the same is going to be true for a volume envelope over here. One thing I like to do with these bass patches is make sure that the attack is at 0 and then basically set up an attack over here. You can see we start with a low point and then we go up. So that is providing a little bit of attack, even though we don't have like any smoothing in here. There's like very, very small amounts of smoothing applied. Final modulation that we have is this velocity, which is also going to the level, but that is of course the auxiliary. So in this case, I'm actually using the source velocity here, and then the LFO is going to be the auxiliary. But you can switch those around however you want. That doesn't really matter whatsoever. And then filter 1 is going to go into filter 2, as you can see, which is just set to the diffuser with these settings. And that is going to be the entire bassline. This is just our phasing processing. And you can see, I mean, the mix, there's not much happening. You can see that there's no effects happening over here. We already saw the modulations. So within the patch, that is everything. And we're just EQing it to get it in shape and adding a little bit of saturation with black box here. But even that isn't technically like needed for the exact sound that we're going after. Yes, it pushes it out a little bit more, but you can just do a little bit of like non-linear processing on it with any saturation plugin and you're going to get something similar. One thing to worry about though is that not every non-linear plugin is made equally, in the sense that Opening up Psyscope, let's add a different saturation plugin, which is the one that I started to experiment with, which is called Lux. I really like this saturation plugin, but it has a low pass, or it has a high pass filter, which introduces a lot of phase shift. And also seems to introduce latency for some reason, which I didn't realize. So fixing that, now we can see in this case, it doesn't get to the point where it actually bleeds into the next transient. And that just purely has to do with the fact that we have a little bit of space here where the volume actually goes to 0. And that means that any of the phase shift from the diffuser and any of the other plugins that we have after here, a little bit from this EQ over here, and in this case, the Lux plugin, none of that is actually phase shifted enough to get into the next part or the next note here, which is essentially all that you want. And this is ideal because it means that we don't even have to resample this bassline. And the reason for that is just because of how little processing we're doing on the bassline and being able to therefore get away with not having to resample it because it simply just doesn't become a problem like bleeding into the next note like you so often have to do with other types of basslines, which are, for example, like a full-on bass, where the amount of processing is so much and the amount of phase shift is so much that they tend to always have to do either a lot of resampling or a lot of trickery within the serum patch to make sure that it doesn't bleed into the next note. The final thing that I want to talk about is the custom shape going into it. As we can see over here, it's just a little edit over here with the sub being lowered. One of the things that I noticed with not just this type of kick and bass, let's set this back to 0. With this kind of kick and bass, but in general with a lot of my kick and basses, is that they sound better when they have less sub and when they're more focused towards the first harmonic. So this harmonic over here, which is essentially all that we're doing here. We're just turning the sub down so that the first harmonic has a little bit of extra space to go through. And I believe I may have slightly raised some of these harmonics, but I'm not entirely sure if I actually did that. We should be able to verify that actually. If we just go like this, and then we switch between that. Yeah, you can see that they're slightly being turned up, so you can see the changes that I made here. And we can also listen to the difference if we want to. It just sounds a little bit more hollow, it sounds a little bit higher, and it sounds a little bit less like it's focused on the lowest and the highest frequencies, and it sounds a little bit more focused towards the middle. Intuitively, it doesn't really make sense because a lot of dance music tends to be focused a lot on the low frequencies and the high frequencies. But in this case, it gives it a nice, almost like tranquility to it, in that it doesn't really become too aggressive in the low frequencies or in the high frequencies. In this case, we're of course not altering the high frequencies, but focusing it more towards the mid-range kind of takes attention away from the other two sides. Like a frequency spectrum is always relative, right? You can have 1K be very loud relative to another frequency, but 1K being very loud on its own doesn't really make sense. Anyway, that's everything that I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to show you this very, very simple kick and bass. Of course, it is still a work in progress, and so is this project, so things may change for this project. Actually seeing how the Lux plugin doesn't bleed into it gave me an idea of just like keeping the Lux plugin in there as well and just carrying that little bit of extra phase shift with it. But that is something that I'll have to figure out while the project is progressing, so that is going to be the end of the video. I hope that you enjoy these shorter ones. Really, I'm recording the shorter ones because it gets too warm in the studio and I become too sweaty. So if you like that I'm literally cooking myself in my own studio to make content for you guys, make sure that you leave a like down below, and while you're there, make sure that you subscribe to the channel as well. Another way that you can support me is by becoming a paid member. You can do that on my Patreon page, on YouTube as a membership, as well as by becoming a Twitch subscriber, with all three of those offering nice benefits in my Discord server and for my content overall. So thank you if you do that. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.